Brigadier, I think, which of course is Romanian for Achtung, Achtung.
It's getting more and more ridiculous.
It certainly is. I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. For any newcomers, a quick word of explanation. This is the Second World War podcast, which rambles off up blind alleys and gets trapped in small haylofts just as the Germans come storming into the front yard. We have almost no discipline and very little respect for authority. If you're looking for a linear narrative, you've come to the wrong place. But if you want to find out about forgotten heroes and dastardly villains, this is the place for you.
Thank you, Al. And we've had a lot of questions into our hashtag, We Have Ways, and we're planning to answer as many of those as we can over the next 45 minutes or so.
Yep.
So please do keep sending them in. We'll do our level best to answer as many as we possibly can. That's certainly leading us down some fascinating paths. And how about a few kind words for the ridiculously underappreciated Brigadier Frederick Morgan and his regrettably out-of-print memoir, Overture to Overlord, lads. And that's by my friend Mike Dolan, who's in Washington.
Right.
He's editor of a history magazine in the USA, and a fine fellow he is too. Frederick Morgan. So Frederick Morgan actually serves in he's a brigade commander, if I remember rightly, in Norway in 1940. Rather sort of failed land effort. Yeah, debacle. Not at sea, but on land. Royal Navy do quite well at sea, but on land certainly they don't. The British Army doesn't do particularly well. Comes back and in April 1943 he's made Cossack, which is Chief of Staff for the Supreme Allied Commander, and they and his team are given the tools with which to kind of start doing early preliminary plans for Operation Overlord, which is going to be D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. Yeah.
So they basically got someone in who had an experience of a disastrous amphibious landing.
Yes.
Not a bad place to start, really.
Well, you learn the lessons, you'd hope.
Yeah.
I think Morgan's a very safe pair of hands. He's very pragmatic. He works very well with his combined coalition staff of Americans and Brits and so on.
Yeah.
And the plan he comes up with is the best possible plan he could have come up with the limitations that are imposed upon him, which is considerably less shipping than is given to the new team when they take over at the beginning of 1944.
Yes, and the new team that take over at the beginning of 1944 is led by Montgomery, who comes in and basically airbrushes Freddie Morgan from history, tears up the plan, says you're going to have to expand the whole thing. You're not putting enough men down in the first instance. And he's come from experience of the Sicily landing, after all.
Yep.
And that's why we don't know about Morgan, because of bossy old Monty coming in and elbowing him to one side. And
well, it is to be fair, it is a different plan. And Morgan is just he is by this stage a staff officer. He is doing what he's doing. And, he did write a book which did quite well post-war. And, there's plenty of people who did an awful lot more than Morgan who are also completely forgotten.
Yeah.
I mean, basically...
But he chose Normandy, though, didn't he?
He chose not... Well, no, Mountbatten chose Normandy. When he was... So before Morgan, it was combined operations that were given the task of sort of looking into where they might go. And it was actually Mountbatten's idea. Of course, by the beginning of 1944, Mountbatten is now Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, and a very good appointment that was. So he's sort of slightly out of the picture, to be perfectly honest. But the plan is kind of, it's a 3-beach plan, not a 5-beach plan. It's kind of, hasn't got the airborne forces, hasn't got the just hasn't got the shipping to do it. And Montgomery takes one look at it as Bedell Smith, who is Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, and Eisenhower, of course, is Supreme Allied Commander. They all look at it and they all come to exactly the same conclusion, which is this is just undercooked. There's
not enough.
More. It's not Morgan's fault. He's doing what he's the plan he's come up with is with the tools he's been given. Yeah. But when you've got the big boys in town, they can impose themselves more and insist upon more shipping. The problem for the Allies is at the end of 1943, 1944, there aren't enough landing ships, which is a big thing. The big thing about Normandy is there is no port. Yeah. There is Port-en-Bassin, there is Arromanches, which are tiny, tiny little fishing ports. There is Cherbourg, which is in German hands and is heavily defended and will be destroyed before the Germans hand it over. There is, of course, Ouistreham. So there isn't a major port that they can use. So how else are they going to get all their supplies over? Allies have this huge material advantage. The problem you've got when you come to D-Day is the race is on between the Allies trying to establish a bridgehead from which they cannot be pushed back into the sea, and the Germans trying to having sussed out where the main invasion is is taking place, getting their mobile reserves, their panzer divisions, their armoured divisions up to Normandy to do that concentrated counterattack. And so the race is on the build-up of supplies. Who can get an overwhelming amount of force into that coastal area quickest? And the problem is not the millions of men and hundreds of thousands of trucks and tanks and all the rest of it that are back here in England and Britain. It's how you get them across the channel to make sure that the amphibious invasion isn't a failure. And that is the thing that trumps absolutely everything when considering invasion. It's as long as you get that foothold, you are going to win. Whether it takes you 77 days, 90 days, 120 days is to a certain point neither here nor there. I mean, it is important, of course, because you want to get on and win the war. But the most important thing is that it doesn't fail. And even with the resources the Allies have, even with the intelligence they have on the Germans, even by keeping their invasion location and date a secret from the Germans, there is still much, much that can go wrong. And there are also all these demands for shipping all across the world by this stage. This is a global war. You don't get onto islands, some atoll in the Pacific without shipping. You can't invade southern France, which Eisenhower's very keen for, without shipping. There are so many demands, and there's just not enough. There's not enough landing ships, which are these much bigger ships, flat-bottomed ships, which can actually carry serious amount of supplies, which you just land straight onto the beach, unload them.
Well, and to the extent, by the summer of 1944, there are enough. They've made the effort, haven't they? And so when the second Mulberry fails on Omaha Beach, they sail the ships straight onto the beach, don't they? And disgorge the supplies that way.
Absolutely, and that works because of these breakwaters off every beach, which has been created by these sunken ships, which are called gooseberries, codenamed gooseberries, which is part of the whole Mulberry planning. So that there are these breakwaters off the coast, which just enables the whole unloading onto these beaches from these flat-bottom landing ships possible. I mean, it is absolutely brilliantly done. I mean, when it comes to kind of big war, big chain logistics, there is no one to touch the British and the Americans.
No. And Morgan played his part. So that was a few kind words we offered there for Michael.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's an admirable guy and he deserves the credit for what he did.
Played his part, but, they had to call in Monty. That's all I'm going to say.
So, why was the unit training in the British Army relatively inconsistent? For example, Monty's 3rd Division better trained in 1940 than most contemporaries. Same detail, Hobart's Mobile Force Egypt in 1939 or Pitt Roberts' 11th Armoured Division 1944, says Mitch A. Palooza.
Well, that's to do with how the British Army had operated. Traditionally, is that generals in divisions were in charge of that, rather than there being a sort of consistent thing because the British Army I think we've talked about this a little bit before. Is an imperial outfit, and you might be in Waziristan, you might be in Malta, you might be in you look at what happened before the First World War, you might be in South Africa suddenly, and there's no point. There's no point in the run-up to a Second World War that you don't want to fight and you've got your actual job of policing the empire as your army role. There's no point laying down a particular way of training people. So that's why unit training in the army is inconsistent. And you get people like Montgomery, who, and he comes up in discussions of training in the war a great deal because it was his thing. It was the thing. His absolute bugbear was getting people fit. And 3rd Division in 1940 were the best rehearsed division in the BEF, and he'd very presently practiced retreating quite a lot, getting over rivers at night, getting out of difficult situations, and keeping the division together. And that's him. It's very much comes down to individuals. A lot of this, and and Hobart's an exception as well because he's one of the military intellectuals. I think you can call him that, knocking around in the 30s.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that the British, there is a tradition of eccentricity
Yeah.
and mavericks, and we have celebrated mavericks. And there's a kind of sort of strange paradox. On the one hand, the British are considered to be incredibly stiff and, traditional and all the rest of it. And yet there is an embracing of mavericks and eccentrics in Britain, in British culture, certainly more so, I think, then than perhaps now, but certainly then. And that reaches into the armed forces, I think, in a way that perhaps other armies maybe not. I mean, the other thing I would say is that I think by 1944, things are slightly different because of Monty's training, because of General Alexander, or Field Marshal Alexander as he is by late 1944, his introduction to the battle schools, which, puts live ammunition for training. There was a sort of consistency of training. And I think certainly by 1944, by Normandy, if that is your mean line of a not bad modern division, I think that the wave lines kind of sort of flutter sort of either side of that, but not by a huge amount.
But the thing is that by 1944 you're kind of on the Third Army anyway that the British have raised. So you've had the BEF, which
is the pre-war
professionals and territorials, and so is a remnant of that. And then you have a second army raised, not the second army, another army raised that ends up in North Africa, that ends up in Italy, that ends up in the Far East, and then a third army, and that army's job is the war in northwestern Europe, the Normandy to the Baltic, and by the third iteration, they've kind of got it worked out. They've got their systems in place. They've
worked out their way of war.
Yeah, exactly. And so the training is more uniform. But certainly at the start of the war, you've got this whole officer culture that there have been intellectuals, but then there's been gentlemen amateurs, and then there's been people playing polo and not interested.
That's absolutely true. But I also think that by 1944, you've still got that, as a divisional commander, you've still got a chance to impose yourself and make your division better than another division. Yeah. And I think, that's always going to be the case. And it's not just the commander, it's also whether there's a sort of gelling between that commander and his immediate subordinate commanders, which then filters down.
But you've also got Adam as the adjutant general.
Yes,
who's
a corps commander in 1940.
Yeah, and I think one of the most fascinating things about the way the army started looking at its men is they come to this assessment that they're not going to be able to ask of the men what they did in the First World War. They've got to approach them differently. They think they're softer. They think they're, and they actually sound sort of like your dad going on about kids these days.
Yeah.
Some of these generals, when you read them, they're softer, they're lazier, they're not as physically fit or rugged as the lads were when I was a subaltern and all that sort of thing. And that's really interesting, and that's taken into account in the way the army's got things we don't think of as being from the 40s, like lots of psychological profiling and lots of resources spent on psychology and dealing with war and dealing with what you ask of the men and how you motivate them and how you motivate them culturally and politically, whether you motivate them politically, all that sort of things in the mix, and certainly by the end of the war, that's all kind of more uniform. And at the start, they're just making it up, because after all, the Second World War is the war no one thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
So the army was looking in another direction, and politicians also were spending money on air forces, or British politicians were spending money on air forces and navies and trying to avoid recruiting a great big army and the problems that come with that.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the whole point of the French alliance in 1939, was that France would do the land bit, we'll do naval power, and we'll do a bit of air power as well. So suddenly after the fall of France and Dunkirk, it's sort of, crikey, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
So suddenly they're having to go from a kind of sort of 10 division army to a 50 plus 52 division army, and that's what a 55 division army rather. That's what they stick with until the end of the war. I mean, it's phenomenal. And again, the actual proportion of that army that is actually frontline fighting troops is comparatively small. And, Britain's a better nation as a result of that.
Yeah.
I mean, we just are.
Yeah.
But the Germans, in contrast, I mean, you've got that. If you go back to that mean line again, and if you think British and American divisions tend to kind of sort of wobble either side of it just a little bit, the Germans are kind of leaping wildly either side of that mean line. I mean, you can have some really dreadful divisions, certainly by 1944, and even in 1940. I mean, I think it's only 32% or something of the armies that invade France and the Low Countries in May 1940 are fully trained.
Yeah.
Amazingly, our
German war
benchmark
machine,
are the Panzer divisions, which amount to only 10 out of 135 that are employed in the Blitzkrieg. So it's there's not a consistency there.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now. Welcome back from that necessary break. My comfort, if you're wondering. We've got some more questions now. There's a question here with a magic word in it for me. Was the PIAT actually any good?
Yes, and first of all, what we should just say is, what is a PIAT?
Well, yes, and that's Dave Ben's question. Well, a PIAT is, it's a man-operated handheld anti-tank weapon. Which is, before we even get into the fact it's a spigot mortar, whatever that is, and
we should say the acronym.
It's projectile infantry anti-tank.
Yeah.
And so you might think of a bazooka as a shoulder-worn anti-tank weapon. You might know about the Panzerfaust, which is the thing that looks like a sort of plant pot with a rocket in it on a stick that you'd fire at a tank. But the British solution is this thing called the PIAT, and it's a spigot mortar. And what that means is, rather than launch something from a barrel, the projectile itself has the barrel on it and sits on a prong in the weapon, and it's such a strange device, this, but actually not bad, and it's had a bad press because it's so strange. And basically it has an enormous spring in it. You lie down, you put your feet, and you cock the spring, and then the spring fires into up the tube in the projectile, which then fires a charge and launches the projectile. And the spring is recocked by that action of the projectile launching. So you only have to cock it the once in theory. Now, obviously, all handheld, man-operated, anti-tank weapons, right from when they were first started in the First World War, where it's rifles for shooting holes through tanks, you've got to get bloody close. You've got to be incredibly brave.
And that's still true in 1945. And that's still true. The final
no
weeks.
matter how much better, and I'm doing my wavy inverted comma fingers there. No matter how much better or effective these weapons get, the zero-sum game of it is you have to get within 30, 20 yards of the thing to hope that your shot counts, which means you've got to be incredibly brave. The tank in question supporting infantry have got to be blind, probably, or being kept down by machine gun fire from your own people to enable you to get close enough. And you've got to have balls of
steel,
of absolute steel. And so I always think when people go, "Oh, the PIAT wasn't very good. I mean, it had a big spring in it, and it goes ping." And I've seen it on a bridge too far, and they miss, and it goes ping, and it looks ridiculous. Fine. I mean, you can say it looks ridiculous as much as you like. If you're the poor sod that's got to crawl up close to something and use it, you've got to. And what's really interesting about it is plenty of people have plenty of success with the thing if they're well trained on it, like any weapon. Yep. They're well trained on it, they know how to use it, they know its limitations, and they use it in circumstances where they're well supported. And you see, or where they're just determined. So, Major Robert Kane, who picked up a Victoria Cross, I think was Jeremy Clarkson's ex-father-in-law or something.
That's right, yeah.
Some strange showbiz thing. He picked up a Victoria Cross at Arnhem, and he would go out with a PIAT on his own, and it's normally operated by two men, a loader and a guy firing it. But he would go out with a PIAT on his own and stalk tanks, and probably not Tigers, probably Panzer IVs or Stug 3s.
So you get up the backside.
Doesn't matter. I mean, he's still got to get within 20 to 30 yards of this thing, or 20 to 30 feet even.
Yeah,
and land literally lob a bomb onto the thing. So I'm not going to not I'm not going to knock the PIAT, and I'm not going to knock anyone who used a PIAT.
No, absolutely not. Well, of course, the other day we were talking about the bridges on the Dive, and we're also referencing Pegasus Bridge and the Orne, and the bridge over the Orne, the Horsa Bridge, and of course on that night about the D Company of the Ox and Bucks have managed to secure both bridges. They're holding them. They're waiting for the counterattack. The counterattack comes at about 2:00 in the morning, when a number of tanks, German tanks, I think the Mark IV, start rumbling down the road from Benouville, which is on the western side, towards them. And Sergeant Wagger Thornton, who has actually been in the team that have captured the Horsa Bridge, charges up to this tank. Sees the crew in the tank aren't aware these guys are there on the bridge already. So some of the crew from the leading tank get out and start conversing with the tank behind, where should we be? Who, there's been reports of whatever. You can imagine what the conversation was. And he gets within an inch of this leading tank, gets on his knee and fires his PIAT, and it brews up.
Yeah.
And it's a massive, the whole thing explodes because it's absolutely stuffed full of ammunition. And the whole thing blows up. It's one of the few tanks from 21st Panzer that actually has got some ammunition that night. And the rest kind of hastily withdraw.
Yeah.
And, had those tanks pressed home their advantage, at that stage of the proceedings, it's very hard to think that the Ox and Bucks could have held on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is a PIAT that saves D-Day.
There you go. Good. That's good enough for me. Because the thing is it's such an interesting genesis, and spigot mortars turn up actually all over the place. So depth charges, when you watch the Cruel Sea, and they're firing those things off the side of a boat, off the side of a ship that pop into the water. Those are spigot mortars.
Yeah,
so the spigot mortar, basically there's a prong, and the projectile is a tube sat on it, and it fires a charge and launches itself. And then the flying dustbin, which is of course on a Churchill AVRE, which is the Royal Engineers had a series of armoured vehicle Royal Engineers, and the flying dustbin was an enormous explosive charge fired from the turret of a tank.
So the range is tiny, isn't it?
Tiny,
but it's a bunker buster.
Your bunker buster. So you'd pull up at the bunker and lob this great big slab of explosive at it, and that was a spigot mortar. And it's this fellow Colonel Blacker, who was obsessed with spigot mortars, and he'd been a soldier in the Khyber Pass or somewhere like that in the 20s. Was one of the first people to teach himself to fly. When he's a First World War sort of adventurer guy, and then did some frontier soldiering in the 20s, and then got into developing weapon systems or weapons. And his thing was the spigot mortar, and his answer to absolutely everything was the spigot mortar. And the Home Guard were equipped with a thing called the Blacker Bombard, which is an enormous spider-like frame with one of these spigot mortar launches on it. And there are photos of these guys sat on this sort of strange frame, and they're obviously supposed to fire it, and it goes ping, and then you run around the front and clip another one on, and it goes ping again. And he got paid £40,000 by the War Office for the Blacker Bombard. And then there was a struggle within the weapons development. Someone went, actually, we could use this much more usefully on a handheld anti-tank weapon, and Blacker's idea got co-opted and turned into the PIAT. But the thing is I think the reason people don't rate it is because it doesn't go bang whoosh like a bazooka or a Panzerfaust.
I think it's because you've got to use your feet to kind of.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't do a big snazzy whoosh bang explosion. You've got to cock it, and it looks daft, and maybe you've got to stand up to cock it. And that's the other thing, is some people describe having, you have to get up to cock it, put your feet on it and cock it, and that's quite dangerous.
Looking down the barrel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm sort of.
But I think every side has weapons envy, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah,
always.
I mean, because this is the thing. Because we're talking about tank busting. I have with me, as a gift from a friend of mine, Robin Schaefer, who's a German historian, which is a military historian, which is the optic from a Tiger tank.
It's absolutely amazing, isn't
and
it? Look at that.
How thick is that? that glass. I mean, it seems to be.
Is that just solid glass in there?
I don't know. It looks like several pieces. Have a look.
It does look like several pieces, and it looks like they're all just sat
Like
together.
sort of laminated or just sat together.
It's absolutely amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you don't look bigger, so it's just
No, it's just a window, isn't it?
bulletproof window. And
Bulletproof
actually-
window.
Is
And
that a
there's
bullet hole?
There's a bullet mark on it. There's a
That's
scuff
amazing,
on it.
isn't it?
Yeah. But tigers were susceptible even to PIATs if you got
If you got up behind them,
up right behind them. And
everything had its Achilles heel.
Yeah.
And actually, the frontal armour on the Tiger wasn't as much as a Churchill tank.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the later marks of the Churchill. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was easily as thicker, wasn't it? The Churchill. Yeah.
But Tigers, I mean, we were just looking at a picture, weren't we, earlier on of, actually, I've got it here, of Michael Wittmann, the famed Panzer ace in his Tiger. And when you see pictures of Wehrmacht soldiers beside the Panzer Mark 1, it's about 6 foot high and it's got a brace of machine guns. And it really does look puny. But when you look at Wittmann in the turret there,
It's a monster.
Look at him. He's an absolute beast, isn't it? You can see why it kind of put the fear of God into anyone who came up against it.
You wouldn't even needed to see one though. You'd just have had to heard about them.
Squeaking and rumbling and all the rest of it. But, the problem with the Tiger, of course, is just not enough of them. And not enough fuel and not enough repairs and too complicated.
Yeah.
I think there were 1,347. In fact, I know there were. Tigers built and 492 Tigers.
How many were there in Normandy on D-Day?
There were none on D-Day, but within a few days there were. There were 136 in total.
So how many were deployed in total to Normandy?
136.
So they're really actually doing a lot of work on the Russian front rather than... They're doing most of their business on the
the
Russian
problem
front.
with, although there was 1,347, once they were knocked out, they tended to stay knocked out because they were just so enormous that there weren't the tank wreckers to... I mean, one of the many advantages of having your main battle tank as a 30-ton tank is that you've got the machinery to kind of move them around.
Yeah.
So if they get, shed a track or run out of fuel or have a kind of bit of, I don't know, turret gets stuck or whatever it might be, as soon as it's dark, you beetle over with your tank wrecker or your low loader or whatever, and you can just whisk it away again. You just can't do that when a tank is 56 tons or 72 tons like the Koenig's Tiger. I mean, you just can't.
Yeah.
So they tend to just stay there forever. And because you're on the defensive for the most part, it's very easy for your discarded battle tanks to then be overrun by the enemy who then get them.
Yeah.
In this case, the Allies in Normandy.
Yeah.
Or the Russians or whatever. Whereas if you're on the attack, you might get hit, but you're likely to go past it, so you've got more time to then retrieve it. So all those things come into play, and what that means is there's not a huge amount of Tigers in the same time as 130 odd Tigers in Normandy. There's probably not that many more in Eastern Front.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them are already dead,
Already done for.
or still coming off the factory line and are going to soon be dead. I mean, they're just, it's just not that many of them. It's a completely impractical tank for Germany in the Second World War. They don't have the support for it.
Yet, if you go to Bovingdon, the Tiger Hall is the busiest bit of the museum.
Because they're awesome.
Tiger
and
Day
they're
is
infamous and because they represent something that we all think is, and also, if you're on the attack and you're the Allies and you won the war at the end of it, you did that despite coming up against Tiger tanks.
Yeah.
So that makes you feel a little bit better, and it makes Commando comics more fun. And you look at it, and we're just looking at this photo now, and we'll post up this photo. But I mean, I look at it, you just think, holy moly, for 1944. I mean, that is just an absolute enormous weapon.
Well,
but
enough words about an enormous weapon. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. And remember the hashtag for all your questions, observations, corrections, etc. And we hope for corrections because we don't know everything we're talking about here. It's hashtag We Have Ways. See you next time.
Yep. Cheerio.